She had everything she was supposed to have at 34. A good job, a small apartment that actually felt like hers, and a group chat that never went quiet. And still, on Sunday afternoons, she felt like she was living inside a glass box. The birthday dinner was at a restaurant with exposed brick and a wine list that went on too long. She got there early, found the table, hugged people she genuinely liked. The conversation moved the way those conversations always move. Somebody got a promotion. Somebody else was thinking about leaving their apartment for something with more light. A third person was seeing someone new and being carefully vague about it. She laughed at the right moments. She asked the right follow-up questions. She was warm in all the ways she had trained herself to be warm, and nobody at that table would have guessed that something behind her eyes had quietly checked out 20 minutes in. That part of her, the part that knew how to show up, how to laugh, when to lean in, and when to give someone space, how to leave at the right time without offending anyone. That part was running perfectly. The ego, you might call it, the social manager, the one who had spent years learning the choreography of rooms like this, and the version of herself she'd brought through the door, the one that was easy and light and reliably good company, that version, the persona, the professional-grade self that has learned which feelings are welcome at the table, was doing its job without any effort at all. The problem was that neither of those things was her, not entirely, and she was only starting to notice. On the drive home, something registered that she couldn't name. Not loneliness exactly. She had just spent 3 hours surrounded by people who knew her name, who would show up for her in a crisis. But something more unsettling than loneliness, something that loneliness doesn't quite cover. The connection she had built in her 20s, the ones that used to feel like enough, had quietly stopped feeding her. She couldn't point to a moment when it happened. There was no falling out, no betrayal, no obvious reason. Everything was fine. Everything felt slightly wrong. This is what nobody prepares you for, that you can build a social life that works and still end up starving inside it. That the architecture you spent your 20s constructing can fit you perfectly and still, somewhere around 34, begin to feel like a house where the rooms are all the right size, but the light has gone out in most of them. She sat in her car in the parking garage for a few minutes before going inside. She wasn't sad exactly. She wasn't angry. She was something harder to locate, present in body, absent in spirit, going through the right motions in a life that had stopped being able to tell her who she actually was. Loss of soul is the name for that feeling. The Sunday afternoon feeling, the glass box feeling, the sensation of watching yourself live your life from just slightly outside it. She didn't know if something was wrong with her. She didn't know if something was wrong with the way she'd been living. She didn't have language for what had just happened in that restaurant, only the faint and unsettling sense that something underneath the surface of her life had been trying to get her attention for a long time, and was now, finally, done being patient. What had been trying to get her attention was not a problem with the dinner. It wasn't the people, or the restaurant, or the familiar rhythm of a conversation she had had 40 versions of before. It was the fact that she had quietly crossed a threshold, and the life on the other side of that threshold no longer fit the version of herself that built it. She had spent her 20s running toward things, a job that meant something, an apartment she could call her own, a circle of people who would show up. These were real, necessary things, the genuine work of building a life. But those goals, the accumulating, the arriving, the building toward stuff, are morning work. The morning of a life is about expanding outward, more connection, more proof that you exist and matter in the world of other people. She was no longer in the morning. Nobody tells you when the shift happens. One day, the same goals that used to feel like fuel feel like furniture. Still there, still functional, but no longer capable of warming the room. She had been standing in that room for months, wondering why she kept feeling cold. This is what that feeling in the parking garage was. Not depression, not ingratitude. It was the signal that she had arrived at the afternoon of her life, and the afternoon requires something the morning never asked for. where the morning says go out and accumulate, the afternoon says go in and reckon. Where the morning says build the self the world can recognize, the afternoon says find the self the world has never seen. She didn't know that yet, only that the dinner hadn't worked. But something else was happening underneath even that. There are, in every person, two layers of self. One is the layer you manage with, the one that reads the room, keeps the schedule, knows how to show up in the world of other people. The other is quieter and much harder to locate. It doesn't care about the promotion or the new apartment. It surfaces in certain silences. It is the thing that sits with you at 2 a.m. when the performance is finally over and you are just you, in the dark, without an audience. She had been feeding one of those selves very well and completely starving the other. The unconscious is everything underneath the dinner conversation, the unvoiced dissatisfaction, the image that surfaces on the drive home, the feeling that doesn't care how good the food was. That feeling had been passing her notes through the glass for a long time. The quieter layer had been patient for years, and it was now done being patient. There is also the drawer you've never opened, the shadow, the parts of yourself that didn't fit the identity you built in your 20s, the longing that felt too strange to name at a dinner table, the question you kept not asking because you weren't sure you were ready for the answer. None of those things disappeared. They went into the drawer, and the drawer, at some point, starts to rattle. What made the dinner lonelier than being alone at home was this. The further you move toward your own interior life, the more the old connections feel like they are happening at the wrong frequency. The love was real. The friendship was real. But she was receiving a signal she couldn't describe, and there was no one at that table she could turn to and say, "Something underneath my life is trying to change, and I don't know what it wants." Not because they would have judged her, but because she didn't have the language. And without language, even real love leaves you alone with the thing you cannot name. Underneath it all, there is the organizing center her ego had been circling for years without ever quite touching. The self. Not the version of her that checks its phone, but the version that knows, in its quieter moments, what it has been waiting for. That was the thing done being patient. That was the thing sitting in the car with her. The dinner wasn't the problem. Her old social life was built for a version of herself that had done exactly what it was built to do, and had now quietly started outgrowing its container. She couldn't go back to the morning, but she didn't yet know what the afternoon was going to ask of her, only that it was asking, and was getting louder. The question is why the strategies that carried her through her 20s stop working, and what is actually underneath the hunger they can no longer feed. The strategies stop working because they were built for a different problem. In the morning of a life, the problem is exposure. The world is large and you are small, and the work is to carve out enough space to matter. So you expand. You collect connections the way you collect proof. This many people know my name. This many people came to my birthday. This many threads tie me to the world, so I don't float away. The expansion is not vanity. It is survival. It is the genuine and necessary labor of building a self that can operate in the world of other people. And for a long time, for most of your 20s, for some people well past that, it works. The more you add, the more solid you feel. But somewhere around 35, the math breaks down. She tried to fix the glass box feeling the way she had always fixed it, with more. Another dinner, another plan on the calendar, another weekend away with people she genuinely loved. And something strange started happening. The more she added, the further away she felt. A full Saturday left her more depleted than a quiet one. A good conversation with a close friend left a residue of something she couldn't name. Not dissatisfaction with the friend, but a faint sense of having just missed something that she couldn't locate. She scheduled more because the alternative felt like giving up. But there is a moment when more socializing produces more isolation, when the old strategy flips into its own opposite, when the very thing that once worked becomes the thing that makes it worse. She had arrived at that moment without knowing it had a name. What she didn't understand yet was that she wasn't fixing the right problem. The hunger she was trying to feed with dinner plans was not a hunger for more outer life. It was, for the first time in her life, a hunger for an inner one. And you cannot satisfy that kind of hunger with more of what satisfied the previous kind. Here is the mechanism. The social self runs on recognition, on the confirmation that the version of you that shows up in the world is real and valued and enough. And for years, it is nourished by exactly that: the promotion, the group chat, the sense of being known by people who have watched your life accumulate. But recognition from the outside can only do so much, because it can only see what you have shown it. Everything you have never shown, the unlived territory, the parts that didn't fit the identity you were building. That material doesn't get fed by recognition. It gets hungry. And at some point, around the threshold she had just crossed, the unlived territory begin asserting themselves, not through crisis usually, through a creeping dissatisfaction, through a feeling that no amount of scheduling can fix. This is what compensation does. The social self runs hard in one direction for long enough, and something underneath starts pushing back. It doesn't announce itself with a diagnosis. It announces itself as a Sunday afternoon you can't shake, a dinner you left early in your own mind, a hunger that keeps returning no matter how much you put on the plate. She thought the feeling was telling her that something was wrong with her social life. It was actually telling her that something was trying to grow inside it. And underneath the compensation is something even older than her personal history. There is a layer of interior life that doesn't belong to your memories or your particular story. It's the part of you that responds to a piece of music or a landscape with an emotion you can't explain and didn't choose. The part that knows certain things wordlessly. This is the collective unconscious, not a theory, but a felt reality for anyone who has ever been moved by something they can't account for. Anyone who has sat in a car in a parking garage and felt, with absolute certainty, that something bigger than their schedule was trying to speak. She had felt it. She just didn't have language for what it was. She also didn't have language for what she had done to herself in the process of building her 20s. Inflation is what happens when the social self mistakes its achievements for the whole story. When the resume and the group chat start to feel like evidence of a complete life rather than the scaffolding around one. She hadn't been arrogant about her life. She hadn't thought she had it all figured out. But she had, without meaning to, begun to treat the structure as the substance. The apartment, the career, the circle, these were real. But they were not the interior of a life. They were the outside of one. And somewhere along the way, she had started confusing the two. The lonelier move, and the one she kept making without knowing it, was projection. On the drive home, something in her wanted to locate the problem in the dinner, or the city, or the particular way her friends had talked that night, or the fact that nobody had asked her the right question. Projection is the moment you read your own interior hunger onto someone else, deciding the dinner party was the problem, when the actual restlessness lives much closer to home. The friends were fine. The dinner was fine. The problem was not outside her. It was a signal coming from deep inside everything happening inside her. The parts she recognized and the parts she had never met. And it could not be fixed by changing the guest list. What that signal was pointing toward was the second self she had never quite met. Not the layer that manages and performs and reads the room. The other one. The one that surfaces in certain silences. The one that sat in the car with her long after the dinner was over. This is the part that doesn't care about social usefulness. It cares about something harder to name: depth, meaning, the sense that the life you are living is actually yours. It had been there all along, waiting with a patience that isn't infinite. And now it was the thing driving the hunger she kept trying to feed with plans. What the afternoon of a life asks is not that you abandon the structure you built. The job, the friendships, the apartment, none of that has to go. What has to shift is where you take your instructions from. In the morning, the instructions came from outside, what the world recognizes, what success looks like, what kind of person earns belonging. In the afternoon, something else starts insisting on being consulted, an interior drive that tells you what is actually alive in you, not what is merely functional. It is the current of attention and desire that has been running underneath everything, quiet for years, now surfacing with an urgency that plans cannot satisfy. The slow work of becoming the person you actually are, not the one you built to survive your 20s, begins here. Not in a decision, not in a dramatic change, but in a willingness to sit with the hunger instead of immediately trying to fix it. She had been trying to fix it, and every time she fixed it, it came back louder, because fixing was still a morning strategy. The afternoon doesn't ask to be fixed, it asks to be listened to. The center of gravity of a personality can shift. It does shift, for people who let it. What begins as loneliness, the glass box, the checked-out feeling, the dinner that left her emptier than before, becomes something else when you stop running from it and start asking what it wants. The loneliness was never the problem. It was the doorway. The question that had been forming underneath her life for months was not, "Why do I feel this way?" It was always the more uncomfortable question, "What does this feeling want from me?" That question doesn't come with an answer attached, but it does come with a direction, and the direction is inward, which means, for the first time, the work is not about adding. It is about learning how to be alone in a way that actually reaches something. Here is what that actually looks like, not as theory, but as something you can do the next time you leave a social event feeling further from yourself than when you arrived. The first move is the hardest, because it asks you to stop doing the thing you have been trained to believe is the solution. Stop trying to fix the loneliness with more activity. Not permanently. You don't have to cancel anything. But the next time you come home from a dinner that left you emptied rather than full, do not immediately open your phone to schedule the next one. Notice which interactions cost you more than they returned. Not because those people are wrong, because the conversation was running on old fuel. That fuel was right for the morning of your life. When you keep pouring it into an afternoon engine and wonder why nothing catches, you are not broken. You are using the wrong fuel. There is a man, intellectually restless, almost entirely cut off from his own interior life, who spent years watching social situations slide away from him, no matter how hard he tried. Profoundly lonely. Then something shifted. He started paying attention to what surfaced when the evening was over, and he was alone with his own thoughts. He worked with what came up, rather than drowning it out. Slowly, he stopped feeling like a lost sheep, and started looking forward to evenings alone, not with resignation, but with anticipation. He had found a center of interest that was entirely his own. The loneliness didn't vanish, but it stopped defining him. That is the second move. Pay attention to what grips you when no one is watching. The old idea you keep returning to, the creative impulse dismissed as impractical, the question that shows up at 2 a.m. and refuses to be filed away. That grip is signal. Everything happening inside you, the parts you recognize and the parts you've never met, trying to hand you something. You don't have to turn it into a plan. You just have to stop dismissing it. The things that keep showing up when no one is asking you to perform them are the things that belong to you. The third move is the simplest, and the one most people will not make. Practice short, deliberate solitude. Not isolation, not numbing out, but sitting with what comes up when the noise goes quiet. 15 minutes, a walk without a podcast. The interior self is not loud. It speaks in images, in the things that move you without explanation. A piece of music that catches you off guard. A moment that tightens your chest before your brain can account for it. The night sea journey is the part no one posts about. The stretch when nothing is wrong and nothing is right. When the old satisfactions have gone quiet and the new ones haven't arrived. It only feels like emptiness if you keep trying to fill it. Active imagination is the practice of staying with what comes up in the quiet, not scrolling past it, not turning it into a plan, but letting the image or feeling develop until it tells you something. Simple acts make a person simple. Silence becomes almost audible. In that silence, the layer that responds to music or landscape with an emotion you didn't choose and can't explain makes itself known. Here is what changes. You stop feeling like the loneliness is evidence that something is wrong with you. You start feeling that it has a shape and a direction. The shift is not dramatic. It begins the moment you stop treating your inner life as a problem and start treating it as a territory. The quiet stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like presence, not of something finished, but of something that has always been there, older than your 20s, older than the persona you built to survive them. What was waiting in the silence was never the problem. It was the part of you the morning had no use for. The afternoon does. And the afternoon, it turns out, has been waiting a long time. This is the thing worth holding on to as you leave this episode. The loneliness you have been feeling in your 30s is not a sign that you failed to build the right life. It is a sign that the life you built did exactly what it was supposed to do, and that something inside you has now grown past the edges of it. The scaffold was real. The scaffold was necessary. You could not have skipped it. But a scaffold is not a building. And somewhere around the threshold you have just crossed, the interior starts asserting what the exterior never could, that the structure was always meant to come down a little, not as loss, but as revelation. Not to expose the ruin underneath, but to show you what has been quietly growing there all along, in the parts of yourself that had no use for recognition, no interest in the group chat, no need to perform for an audience that could not see them anyway. The loneliness had a name. It was never a malfunction. It was the signal that everything happening inside you, the parts you recognize and the parts you've never met, had begun to ask for something the morning of your life was never designed to give. Think of the sun at noon. There is a single moment when it reaches the top of its arc, the moment of greatest height, the moment everything the morning worked toward has finally arrived. And then the descent begins. Not as failure, not as ending, as the beginning of a different kind of light. The morning sun is bright, and it moves fast, and it is very good at making things visible from a distance. The afternoon light is slower. It comes in at an angle. It finds the texture in things the morning flattened out. It is the light you need to see what is actually in the room. You are not losing your life. You are entering the part of it where the light finally works differently. That is not the beginning of loss. It is the beginning of the part that was always going to matter most.